Hey everyone, my name is Anson. We're back with a brand new video. I'm going to teach you all how to write end-to-end tests in Nest.js to test your GraphQL server. Now, if you're looking for end-to-end testing for REST APIs in Nest, this is not the video, but I do have a video that I made a few months ago that you all can check out. I'll leave a link to that in the description. A couple things that we need to actually discuss before we get into the end-to-end test is that there is a little bit of setup that we need to do, because you can't just write end-to-end tests and run them and expect it to just work. Because when it comes to end-to-end tests, you're actually hitting the actual API and you're hitting the actual database itself. And any other external APIs that your API might be calling, you're actually going to make calls to them. Hence why end-to-end tests are generally known to be a lot more expensive and slower than unit tests. So there's no mocking involved at all. Everything that you are doing is involved with actual realistic data, as if a user was typing it in and sending it to, a server through the client. But here's the thing though, we need to make sure that when we are running our end-to-end tests, that it's running while it's connected to a test database that has nothing to do with our local development database or any other, staging environment database, and definitely not the production database at all. The reason why you want to make sure that you are using a separate test database is because what you're going to be doing is, before and after you run your end-to-end tests, you're going to drop the database. Now you're probably wondering, why do I have to do that? Well, I'll give you a simple example. So let's say we have a clean database, nothing in the database at all. Doesn't matter if you're using MySQL or MongoDB, doesn't matter. So let's say the database is empty, and we have two endpoints. We have a post endpoint to create a user, and then we have a get endpoint to get a list of all the users. So when you call that get endpoint, it will return to you all of the users that are in the database. So let's say I write a test where I make an API call, a post request, or a mutation to the server, and I'm creating one single user. Now that user is going to be saved to the database. And then what I'm going to do to complete the test is I'm going to call the get users endpoint, or I'm going to query the user in GraphQL. And then I'm going to write an assertion that the response coming back from the server is going to, of course, be an array that has only one element, which is that user that I just created. So our database has exactly one user currently. So the assertion passes, and then the test is finished, and then we're done. Now, if I run the test again for the second time, and again, we're not changing any parameters at all, we're not changing any test data, it's the same exact test, same exact API calls or GraphQL queries, same exact assertions. Okay, we're still asserting that only one element is in the array that is returned from the server, from the response. Now, when I run the test again, it's going to create another user, but database currently has one user already. So by creating another user, I'm then going to have two users now total in the database. So when I call either the get request, or if I use a query to the GraphQL server, it's going to give me a total of two users, which will make my assertion false. So it calls the test to fail. And this is where the problem becomes on why you need to make sure you are dropping your database or cleaning it up before or after, or both, whenever you run the tests. Because if you don't, the leftover data from the previous tests may cause your assertions to fail. And obviously you don't want to change your assertions, because that will defeat the whole purpose of the test itself, because you're going to need to keep on changing the assertion every single time, because it's just going to become an n+1 problem. Okay, instead of dropping the database, you're just going to keep creating new users every single time. So then you're going to change the assertion from asserting that two users are there to now three, to now four users, to now five users. And obviously that wouldn't make any sense at all. So the solution to this is to actually just clean the database. The easiest thing to do is just dropping it, because you don't need it anymore. And if you are using a SQL database, you can just simply synchronize the database by creating all of the tables again, which is a common practice that many people tend to do. So that's okay. Now, one quick thing that I do want to mention is that you need to make sure that you don't use absolute paths like this one right over here. Notice how it doesn't have any // in front of it. It's just referencing source / GraphQL / model / user. This is an absolute path starting from the source directory. This will actually cause your tests to throw an error saying that it cannot resolve or find that module. So I'll show an example. I'm going to run the test E2E command, and this should throw an error. Yep. See how it says cannot find module source GraphQL models users or user from, and then this file right over here, which is this users.module.ts file. That's because of this absolute path right over here. So to fix this, you need to make sure that everywhere you replace this absolute path with a relative path, and it's pretty easy. So for example, right over here, I'm trying to import this user class from my source GraphQL models user file. So all I got to do is I just got to see where I currently am. I'm in the users.module.ts file, which is inside the users folder. Since the users folder is on the same level as the GraphQL folder, that means I just have to go out one folder like that, one directory, and then step into the GraphQL directory, and then there you go. Okay, it's pretty easy to do. So I'm not going to do that for this entire video, but I just wanted to mention this because I know that some of you might have ran into this issue, and some of you will definitely run into this issue. So I wanted to show that just to kind of like warn you all. Okay, but just make sure that you go through your code base and you replace all the absolute paths with relative paths, like how I'm doing it over here. So for example, I'll do one more. This one right over here, we have to go into the GraphQL folder. So since I am in the users folder currently, I just have to go out one directory and then step into the GraphQL folder, and then resolvers, and then user settings resolver, which will get me to this folder right over here. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you all how we're going to set up our end-to-end tests. Now I will run that npm run test E2E script again, just to show you all that the cannot find module error goes away after I fix all the absolute path imports. But now it is trying to connect to the database. And forgive me if I did not mention that earlier. I might have, but I'm just going to mention it again just in case, that yes, we are actually going to be interacting with a SQL database, because that's the whole point of an end-to-end test. Okay, assuming that you do have a database connected, of course. But in which case we do, so we're going to want to connect to it. But we, of course, remember how I said earlier, we can't just connect to any database. We don't want to touch our local development database. We want to make sure we are connecting to a test database. Now, how do we make sure we do that? Well, one way that we can do this is we can actually set an environment variable. So what will happen is when our application reads the environment variable, it will say, hey, you know, this environment variable is equal to, let's say, test, for example. That will indicate that we're currently in a test mode. We're trying to run end-to-end tests. So do X, Y, and Z. And what is X, Y, Z in this case? Well, X, Y, Z would be anything that is relative to ensuring that you're setting up your application to be in a test-ready environment. So one thing that we need to do, of course, is making sure that if we're in a test environment mode, that the test database credentials are there instead of the actual local development database credentials. So right over here, and actually let me change this to LF, but inside this app.module.ts where I am initializing type ORM module.forRoot, this is where I have my database credentials. So of course, when I'm developing, this is where I would, put the username, the password, the database name, all that kind of stuff to be able to connect to the database. I want to make sure that if I am in a test environment and I don't want to connect to the actual local development database, but I want to switch to a different database, and it's actually not that complicated actually. So I'll show you one easy way that we can do this. So what I'll do is inside test E2E, I will simply set an environment variable. And since I'm on Windows, this is different on whichever operating system you're using, but since I'm on Windows, I'm going to use set node env equals test. Okay, and I'm going to use the ampersand sign, double ampersand sign, So that way this will run this command, and then it will run the jest script to run the end-to-end test. And then what I'll do additionally is inside here, inside app.module.ts, I'll console log process.env.node.env. Now you don't have to necessarily set this specific environment variable. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to use node_env because that's a common variable that many people use. So now if I run this script again, you'll see that it should log this right over here. Okay, see how it logs test. So now what I can do is this. Before I do anything else though, let me do one more thing. Let me go ahead and just simply run the dev script just to show you that without setting that node_env variable, because by default it's not set, or I think by default it might be development. Okay, so it's not set by default. See how it's now logging undefined? Okay, so that's okay. So by default that variable is not set. So that's good. So what we want to do now is we'll place our username and our password here. So my username is test user, and now I'm connecting to my local SQL server. So you'll just place your credentials here. So my password for the username for the user is test user 123. And now here, you want to make sure that you're not connecting to your local development database, but the test database itself. So let me show you this real quick. I'm going to go and log into my SQL server using the SQL shell, and I'll type show databases, and you'll see I currently have the default SQL databases, but I have this GraphQL tutorial database that I had from my GraphQL Nest.js tutorial from a previous video. So let's just assume that this is our local development database that has all of our local development data. I don't want to touch that data at all. So instead of connecting to this database, I want to connect to a test database. So what I'll do is I'll use a ternary operator because I want to have a condition set where based on the node environment node_env variable value. So if it's equal to test, then the database name will be GraphQL tutorial test. If node_env is not set, then we'll just assume that it's going to be for development. Of course, typically it is good practice to set node_env to development if you're in a development mode, because some people do set node_env for production. Okay, but I'll just keep this simple. So we'll assume that if node_env is undefined, or if it's just anything but test, then the database will just be GraphQL tutorial. So this will ensure that the term, based on the environment variable, it will target the correct database. Cool, so that's pretty much it with that. So we don't have to do anything else with this. So now watch this. I'm going to go ahead and go back into this PowerShell, and I'll run the script again. Now there shouldn't be any issues with connecting to the database, but it will throw an error because the database does not exist. Let's see. Okay, so something weird is actually going on. If you look at the logs over here, it's actually targeting the GraphQL tutorial database instead of the GraphQL tutorial test database. And I actually had to figure out what was going on because when I was logging process.env.node_env equals test, it actually was equal. It was actually false, and I was wondering why. And I actually looked it up on Google. And so what's actually going on is, at the end of, let's see somewhere. I think, yeah. So it's actually combining this empty space right over here. So I'll show you real quick, because when you just look at it like in the logs, so I'll show you right here. And let me actually turn off logging just to kind of like make it easier for us to see our console. You'll see that if you look in the console, it'll say test. Okay? And nothing else. It looks fine, but then if you try to compare it to test like this, it'll say false. So it's because at the end there is a white space. See how it says false right here? Yeah, there's a white space at the end. So if I were to do test with a white space, then that would be true. So I did also want to mention that as well, because some of you might run into that issue. So there's two things, there's two ways, there's a couple ways that you can handle this. I think what I could do is go into the package.json file and remove this white space over here, because I think the double ampersand sign will still work. It's not going to like think that this is two. It's not going to like kind of like combine these two together as and treat it as if it was one command. So I think this should be okay. So let's test it out and make sure it still works. It seems like there's no issues. Okay, there we go. See, now that fixed it. So we'll leave it. We'll leave the way that we are setting the environment variable in this script. We'll leave it like this for now. So just remove the white space, and it should be okay. Otherwise, you're going to have to trim the white space at the end, which I don't think that we need to do that. So yeah, let's just leave it like that for now. So now you can see that it is actually trying to target the GraphQL tutorial test database, but because we don't have that database created, it's going to say unknown database. So what you can do is you can create the database. So create database, GraphQL tutorial test. But you don't have to worry about creating the actual tables, because type ORM will take care of that for you. So now that I created my database, I can go ahead and run this whole thing, and I'm not going to get this unknown database error anymore. Okay, so we just get the error from the default end-to-end test that the project scaffold had for us, which we can just simply remove because that's not relevant to this tutorial at all. Okay, now we can actually begin writing some tests for our GraphQL server. How do we do that though? So the idea is, because GraphQL itself is actually not its own protocol, it's served over HTTP in case some of you didn't know that. What actually happens is whenever you are interacting with the GraphQL server, the GraphQL client actually makes a post request to the GraphQL endpoint. So when you set up a GraphQL server, there will be a GraphQL endpoint on the HTTP API. So you can actually still have a REST API, and in fact, you need a REST API with the GraphQL server, but you can still have other REST endpoints in conjunction with your GraphQL queries and mutations as well. But what happens is the GraphQL client will make a post request to that GraphQL endpoint, and it will send a request body that contains the actual GraphQL query, which then the GraphQL server will interpret. Okay, so we actually will test the GraphQL server by simply making post requests to that GraphQL endpoint. So here's what we'll do. First, let me also give you all some context as well to show you what we're going to be testing, because I know that this project is from a previous GraphQL and NestJS tutorial. So let me show you the schemas very quickly. I have two queries right over here: get user by ID and get users. Pretty straightforward. This query gets the user by its ID. It gives us one user, and then get users gives us a list of all of the users in the database. We have two mutations. One is to create the user, and one is to create user settings. Okay, and then we have two types. We have a user type, and then we have a user settings type. And then the user itself has a field called settings that is of type user setting. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense and gives you all some context with what we're actually going to be testing. So what I'll do is I'll write a simple test where we query get users, and we will write an assertion that expects the response to be an empty array, because we currently don't have any data at all in the database. So let's do this. Let's go ahead, right down over here, right after the before each hook, we'll use a describe function to name our test suite. So I'll call this get users. Okay. And then what I want to do is I want to use the it function to name my test, because this is where we're actually going to have our testing logic. And I'll say it should query get users and assert and return 0 users. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to actually use supertest, which is already part of the project scaffold. When you set up your Nest.js project, it does already come with supertest installed, so you don't need to install anything additional. And you can see over here that it was already imported up top over here because it was used in that default test case that they provided for us. So I'm just going to use supertest. I'm going to use this request function, and we actually need to return this. So return request. And then what we want to do is we need to reference this Nest application instance, which is this right over here. So, actually, let me kind of I apologize for not doing this before, but let me actually kind of explain what's going on. So they have this app field right over here, this variable, and they have this before each running, which will basically run before every single test. And then basically before each test, what they are going to do is they're going to go ahead and create the module fixture. So they'll call test.createTestingModule. So this will initialize the entire application as a testing module, and they call compile. And then what they do over here is they call module fixture.createNestApplication, and then they pretty much call app.init. So it's very similar to how inside the main.ts file, when you bootstrap the application, it's very similar to this, but this is for the actual testing instance itself. Okay, so what they do is they assign this create nest application return value, which is basically the inest application instance, to app, and then we can actually reference this inside the scope of this entire describe block over here. Okay, but this app instance allows you to get access to the HTTP server, which is what we need, because if you have used supertest before, you are familiar with that this request function needs an instance of the actual server itself. So you would pass in that server instance, which is what we're doing, and then we can actually call the post request method, or if you are using a get request, you would use .get. But we're not going to be using that. We're using post. And then we're going to make a post request to that GraphQL endpoint, like that. And then we want to send a request body. And all we're going to do is send a GraphQL query. So the way we do this is we actually need this query field. And all we're going to do is just write out our GraphQL query, a raw GraphQL query, as a string. Okay, so now if you prefer to actually do this, there are actually packages where you can create a GraphQL query and then convert it to a string. You can do that as well. I'm just going to keep it simple. So inside the string, what I'll do is I will have a set of curly braces, because it's similar to how you would do it in the GraphQL playground. Okay, so curly braces, and then we will call the get users query, and then we can ask for whatever data we want. In this case, we need to at least have at least one subfield. So I'll get the ID, username, and display name. And I know this can be a little bit weird to kind of read, so that's why I would recommend using a library where you can write an actual GraphQL query or mutation and then kind of stringify it. All right, so now after we send the query to the server, of course, the server is going to give us back a response, and then we can actually begin writing assertions to determine what the data is expected to be. Very quickly, though, I want to kind of show you again how the data looks like when you receive it from GraphQL. So when I query get users, it's going to give me back this object, and it's going to have this data property, and then it's going to have the name of the query as a property right over here. And then by accessing that property, you get access to the actual data that you want. Okay, so in order to actually access the array that we're expecting to come back from the server, assuming that the response is successful, we want to be able to we need to target this get users property on the data property, which is on the response body. So what we're going to do is after we call .send, we're going to call the .expect method, and then it expects a callback function, and then that callback function has the response body or the response object as an argument. And then through this response object, you can actually access the response body. Okay, so I'll just very quickly log res.body to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to run the test right now, and you'll see that it will log an empty array, or it will log this object that has the data property. That data property is an object that has the name of our query getUsers, which maps to the empty array. Okay, so now let's actually write a proper assertion. So I'll go ahead and use the expect method, and this is where we expect our value to be something. So we will target res.body.data.getUsers, the name of our query, and then we want to make sure that it's actually an empty array. So the best matcher that we could use is toEqual. Okay, and then we can also, additionally, if you want to also do this instead, you can do, instead of using toEqual, you could also do let's see, to have length 0. Okay, because we know that it's going to be an array. Let's run the test again. Make sure it actually passes. Okay, there we go. It passes. And just to ensure that we're not having any false positives, here's what I'll do. Let's just leave it as to have length. Okay, and then let me negate the test. And this should fail because obviously we know that it does have length 0. And there you go, it fails, which is good because we know that the actual expected value is supposed to be an empty array. So that's good. All right, so that's how we can write a very simple test to test our GraphQL server. Let's go ahead and actually do some more. Let's write a test where we are actually creating data now. So this will be a little bit more interesting. So let's do this. Here's what I'll do. I'm going to keep everything inside this same test suite, but I'm going to name this users because I don't want to have a bunch of test suites. I'll just keep everything under one. So this test will verify that there are 0 users. We will write one test now to create a user. So it should create a user using create user mutation. It's good to be descriptive, but also short with your test names. So now what we're going to do is make a post request to the GraphQL endpoint, but we'll send a mutation to the GraphQL server. So return request app.get HTTP server, then post /GraphQL like this, and then we're going to call .send. So we still will need this query property, and then we will use single quotes to write our query. So we need to actually prefix this with mutation, and then a pair of curly braces, and then the name of our mutation, which is create user. Create user with the parentheses. Okay. Now, let me go back into our schema docs. So our mutation, we are using an input type, and it's this create user input right over here. So I need to specify this create user data because that's the name of the argument. So create user data colon and then a pair of curly braces, and then now the actual fields for that input type. So username and display name. So we'll do username first, username Anson, and I'm going to use double quotes for this string because I'm using single quotes for the entire query itself. And then, so username and then comma, and then display name, and then we'll just do Anson. Well, actually, username should be Anson with a lowercase a. Okay, so let's see. Let's go outside of the parentheses. Okay, and then we want to actually specify what fields we want to be returned. So I want the ID, username, and display name. All right, and we're done with that whole mutation query, or that whole mutation. Okay, so now let's go ahead and expect. We're going to go ahead and expect a status of 200 to ensure that everything is good. Before I write any other assertions, let's just actually run the test to verify that everything is working. So let's run the test script again. Make sure everything's good. All right, perfect. So the entire tests pass, everything's good. And what I can do is, let me actually open up the MySQL shell. Over here, use GraphQL tutorial test. Select from users, and you'll see that I have my record right over here. So it did in fact work, and our tests are done. Okay, but remember what I said earlier about how after our tests have finished, the data is still in the database, so we will need to clear the database and then allow the data to be populated again. Otherwise, we're going to have a bunch of data that is not applicable to our test, which will cause it to, which will cause some of the assertions to fail. Okay, but here on, we know that our test is working, and additionally, what I could do is I could write more assertions to verify that the response return from this mutation is giving us the valid object. So what I can do is I can write another expect by chaining it to this expect over here. So I'm just going to call .expect again, and then pass in a callback function and get access to the response object. And then what I'll do is inside this callback function, I'll write expect res.body.data, and then the name of our mutation, so create user. And then what we're going to do is we're going to expect this object that's returned to equal, and then we'll have it equal to the object that we expect it to be. So in this case, we can actually predict what the ID is going to be all the time, because in this test, we know that we're always going to create the first user, assuming that this test is the first test to run and create the user. So we can always assume that the ID will be 1. However, if this test is executed after other tests that may be responsible for creating users, then you cannot use this. Okay. So, but we'll keep it simple. So we'll leave it like this for now. Anson. Now, one thing that I do want to point out very quickly, which is relevant to what I was talking about earlier, if you don't drop the database, and let's say in this example, we create another user, the second time we create the user, the ID will be 2. So you can see right over here, it expected the ID to be 1, but the ID is in fact 2. Because the second time we run the test, it's going to create a second user. That second user is going to have its ID auto-incremented in the database, so it'll go from 1 to 2. So that user's ID is 2, but when we return it from the server back to the response, back to the client, we expect the ID to be 1, but it's in fact 2, so that will cause this test to fail. Okay? So what we'll do is we'll drop the database before and after we run the test. So it's actually really simple to do. A couple things that we do need to do, however, though, is this. So you can see right over here, right now, all this logic actually runs before every single test, and we actually don't want that. We actually want it to run once, because it doesn't make sense to create this instance over and over again. There's just no need to do it. Sometimes you might need to, if you need to reinitialize the application again, but there's no need for us to do that in this situation. So what we'll do is we'll change this from a before each to a before all. And this is just part of jest. Okay, it's a global. Before all is a global function that will basically run once before all of your tests. Okay, so let's just make sure that this doesn't mess up any of our tests at all. Well, actually, it will mess up this part over here. But let me actually just quickly remove the ID. So we'll assert the username and display name in the object are going to match. Because I want to just actually just test that this before all will not be affected, will not affect our tests. Well, actually, it'll break the first one, of course, because the first one we're expecting a length of 0. We'll receive length 2. Okay, but it still works fine though. Like our tests are still passing, and the configuration is working fine, so that's okay. So we'll actually, let me Control Z this. Let me undo this, so we'll leave it alone for now. So the before all is working fine. So what we want to do is we need to get access to the connection of the database. Now, in older versions of TypeORM, the easiest way to do that would be you would just simply do this app.get, and then you would just pass in this connection token like this. And actually, this should be imported from TypeORM, not whatever that was. That was, I think, the MySQL driver. Yeah, we don't want to import that one. We want to import connection from TypeORM, but this is deprecated, so you definitely should not use this. But what you would do before is you would pretty much do app.get connection, and then you would reference any properties you need or call whatever methods you needed to. But you can see that a lot of stuff was changed in the newer versions of TypeORM. So I'll show you how to do it the new way. So what we want to do is we want to import this data source class from TypeORM. And what we'll do is we'll simply call app.get, and then we'll pass in the data source instead of connection. And it's really roughly just the same thing. Okay. And what I want to do is I simply want to do this. Let me assign data source to app.get. And now what we can do is we can call data source.synchronize. And if you see over here, it says if set to true, then it drops the database with all of its tables and data. And then it creates the database schema for all entities registered in this connection. So that's going to be all of these entities right over here, user and user setting. So it will create tables based on those entities, which most of you already know that already if you've used TypeORM. But we want to actually set, we want to actually pass a Boolean. We want to make sure we set drop before sync to true, because we do want to drop the database. So this will pretty much drop the database for us and then create the database and its tables. And this is, of course, going to be an asynchronous method call. So it returns a promise, so we need to await it, and then we can call app.init. So let's actually test this out. So let's run npm run test E2E, and we should not get any issues. Okay, there you go. So now look at this. We just ran both tests. They both passed. Okay. Let me go into my database shell. Let me type show databases. So you'll see that we still have this GraphQL tutorial test database over here. Actually, I gotta do tutorial test, and then I can select from user. So we still do have the data over here. That's okay, but let's actually run. Let's run the test again, and if our before all hook works correctly, yes, so the test passes again, and notice how nothing happens to the data. But what really happened was when we ran the test, before the tests were executed, it ran this callback function for the before all hook. Okay, we dropped the database, created all the tables, so our database was in a clean state. And additionally, I would also recommend using the after all hook to simply drop the database again, so that way you don't have any of that leftover data. You don't have to do it, but I would recommend it. So what we can do is we can just simply do this. We can get access to the data source since we have access to the app already. And then I can just do await data source dot And then I'll do drop database. Okay, drops database and all its data. And then synchronize will create the database schema. Let me also add the async keyword as well. And then after all the tests are done, we also want to make sure we do a couple things, kind of like a cleanup for our tests. So we want to make sure we, one, close the database connection, because that's important. So I can reference data source dot close, or actually close is deprecated. So you have to use destroy. So database data source dot destroy. This is an async method, so let's await it. And then let's close the app alone as well. So the Nest app. So to await app.close. And that should take care of closing up the database connection and the app. Okay, because notice how when we ran the test, we had this issue. This usually means there are asynchronous operations that weren't stopped in your tests. Having the database connection open and the app open is one of those issues that lead these tests to not gracefully exit after the tests are finished. Okay, so it's good to always do this because it's good practice. Okay, additionally, also what I should do is I should also make sure that data source is truthy. And I'll just write a log saying closing database connection and app. Alright, so let's run everything now. Let's see what happens when I run this script. Okay, there we go. And notice how now, this time when I ran the test, it actually exited. Before, it was just kind of like stuck. It was like stuck in that buffer. But now it actually exits, so I don't have to forcefully exit it. You see how it said console log over here, closing database connection and app. So that's good. We verified that that is working. So I'll just remove that console log. Let's see. Actually, let me just fix this as well, because let me also put this out over here as well, because we still want to make sure we close the app as well, even if there is no data source. But okay, so you can see that our test passed, so that's good. Why does it say app controller? Is that the name of our? Oh, that's the name of our describe. Let me change this to GraphQL server. Okay, and then let's go into our SQL server shell. If I do select asterisk from users, you'll see that GraphQL tutorial test users does not exist. So the table doesn't exist, but the database does exist, and that's okay, because the database can exist. That's fine. The tables just aren't there, and that's totally fine. So we have a working solution for end-to-end tests. So yeah, just to reiterate, we were able to run our end-to-end tests, and we can run it consistently, because every single time we run the test, it will drop the database, and then it will run all of our tests. Okay, and it drops it once before all the tests run, and then after all the tests run, we drop it. Okay, and of course, without this after all hook with the tests, without that, if I run the test, it's going to just stay stuck. You'll see right over here, it says the same message that we had earlier. Okay, and you have to manually do Control-C to exit out of it, which is, not ideal. And you definitely don't want your test to hang like it's doing over here, because that might prevent your pipeline from progressing. In fact, I think it will, actually. So you want to make sure you do these types of operations where you close any database connections, close any possible WebSocket connections, any other protocols, things like that, so that way you don't have it, just staying connected, because it could also cause other problems too, memory leaks, stuff like that. So just pay attention to that. Okay, but we have a good solution working, and you can now pretty much write end-to-end tests that work consistently every single time. Okay, so let's do one more. Let's do this. Let's write one more test. I'll just simply copy this one right over here. And what I'll do is I'll just change this to verify that the returned users is one user. Okay, and this will say to have length 1. And let's run it again. And we should have all 3 tests passing. Okay, there you go. And it all passed. And now we have a great setup for end-to-end tests for GraphQL in Nest.js. One more thing that I'll quickly show you all is how we can write these raw queries a lot easier, because if this was a bigger query, it can be very hard to read it. So what I'll do is I'll actually install this package. It's called GraphQL tag. Terminal. Okay. So let me install that. GraphQL tag. And then the other package that you need to make sure you have, of course, is GraphQL, which if you're using GraphQL in your Nest.js project, you already have this. You should already have this package installed already. So I have GraphQL and GraphQL tag. And what I can do is I can import this print function from GraphQL. And then I can import this GQL function from GraphQL tag. If you've used Apollo before, then you're definitely familiar with this GQL function. And what I can do is I can use the GQL function to write my queries and mutations. So I'll show you an example. I'll take this whole mutation right over here, and I'll create a variable. I'll call it create user mutation, and then equals, and then we reference GQL, and then we provide a pair of backticks. These are backticks right over here. And I'm going to paste in the mutation. You can kind of see how it auto formats that for me, which is great. Okay. And then what I can do is I can take create user mutation. And then I'll kind of show you what it looks like when I console log this. But if I actually just console log create user mutation, and let me run the test for all of you to see what it looks like when we log it, you'll get like this sophisticated object that doesn't actually give you the actual raw string alone. So you see how we have these properties, which we don't even really need to worry about. So what we can do is we can actually use the print function, and we can actually just call print and then pass in our this is a node itself, and then let's run this again, and you'll see that it logs the actual mutation. Okay, and then what I can do is I can actually take this and go down over here, and we want to make sure we actually wrap this in between single quotes, because if I were to just pass it in like this, it wouldn't work. You'll see that the test will fail. Well, actually, you know what? It actually passes, surprisingly. I guess I tried this earlier and it didn't work, but now it does. I guess I might have been doing something wrong. But it does work, so that's good. And you can do the same thing for all these other queries, so let's just quickly kind of change that over. But if you pass just the create user mutation, obviously that won't work because that's not the actual raw GraphQL query itself. Okay, so let's see. Let's go over here. Let's copy this whole thing right here. And actually, you know what? Let me move this into a file. So let's go over to source. I'll create a folder called. Actually, should I put that inside GraphQL folder instead? You know what? I'll create a utils folder inside source, not inside GraphQL. And I'll just create a file called queries.ts. And I'll go ahead and copy this mutation query over here. And I'll import GQL from GraphQL tag. Just like this. And note that we don't have any curly braces wrapping the GQL. We're just importing it like this. Okay. It's a default export, not a named export, so there's no curly braces. Just wanted to clarify that. All right, so let me remove this right over here, and I don't need this import anymore inside the spec file. But I do need to import the create user mutation, so I will. And let's just make sure it is an absolute path, because if it's not, it's going to throw an error. Whoops, let's see. Hold on. So I need to go outside the test folder. Okay, there we go. So I had to go. So right now this file itself is in the test folder, so I have to go out one into the source folder, and then that'll get me to this file over here. Okay, so let me create the get users query. Let's see. And you can also name these specific to your tests, but a lot of times you might end up reusing a lot of this anyways, so that's why it makes it more suitable to do this, because you can just reuse these queries and you don't have to write them all over again or copy and paste a really long string everywhere. So we're going to copy this right over here, paste that right there, and I'll go into over here in our first test, call print, and then we'll import that get users query. Okay, and that's going to be imported from the same file, so we don't need to worry about updating that path because it's already been updated already. Let's run the test again, make sure that this works. Okay, good. And of course, if I were to kind of mess this up, it would throw an error, of course, because this is obviously not the valid syntax. See, syntax error, so that's good. And then let's do, let's see. Well, I guess, see, this is the good part, is since we already had the same query above, I can just reuse that right down over here. So print get users query, just like that, and then run this. And there we have it. So yeah, that is going to be pretty much it. Hopefully this puts you all in a good position of learning how to write end-to-end tests in Nest.js, but specifically for your GraphQL server. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. I figured since I was doing a Nest.js and GraphQL tutorial, I might as well create a follow-up on how to write end-to-end tests, because I absolutely love testing code. I love writing unit tests, and I also love writing end-to-end tests. I think it's very important. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment down below. I do my best to reply to as many comments whenever I can. And if you like the video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in my next video. Peace out.